If you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I've talked about this for a really long time, getting rid of my old bench and replacing it with a Benchcrafted Split-Top Roubo bench. I bought the plans and I built the base, and that's what I'm going to go through today. This definitely gave me some anxiety because there are a lot of big challenges on this. I'll build the top in a few weeks and I'll go through some of those challenges. The biggest challenge for me is I live in Switzerland, and when I came over from the US I did not bring a lot of tools with me. And the plans are all in inches, and you can't convert everything to metric because it just won't line up. Working in inches means that I need to have a whole bunch of new tools in order to build this thing. I'm using maple for my bench, and here I'm just finishing up the rough milling of the legs. I glued these two pieces up for all four legs to get the 3.5 inch thickness that I needed. Once I got everything to the right thickness, I then got everything to the right width using the thickness planer, which I think worked really well. To trim the length of the legs, I really didn't have any other choice but to use my chop saw. I really don't trust this chop saw to be very accurate, but it worked pretty well. I had to do quite a bit of fine tuning and some testing before I did it, but I was really happy with the outcome. Now, this is something that I saw on Timber Biscuit, and I thought this was a really good idea. I put all four legs up on the bench in the right order and then started rough marking them. That way I kind of know where all of the mortises are going to be, where all the holes are going to be, even though they're not really in the right locations yet because I haven't really laid them out. This just gives me a good visual feel for where everything's going to go, because this is pretty complex. There's a lot of holes and a lot of mortises that need to go in the correct locations, and so this helped a lot, I think, to visualize. And now to mark out all of the mortises and the tenons, I used a combination of a marking gauge and marking knife for everything. I also then reinforced that with a pencil. Especially here for the tenons, it's really important to have nice deep knife lines here, because I'll come back with a chisel and clean those up right up to that line. Here's how it looks when it's all laid out. I spent probably a good day doing this, but I think it was really important. This is probably the most important step of the whole project, is getting everything really nicely laid out. I even found a couple of mistakes that I would have made had I not done this and set it up and look at it again, look at the drawings and go back and forth. So I found this step to be super helpful. I'll start by drilling the holes for the dowels that will be used for the drawbore mortise and tenon joints for the upper and lower short rails. And for this, it's just a 3/8 inch bit that I already had. I bought this in the US, but I'll leave a link down below where you can get that here in Europe. I decided to buy the Knockdown Hardware from Benchcrafted. That'll allow me to break down my bench while I'm building the top. I can sort of store it on the side. First thing you need to do is I need to drill a hole for the head of the bolt to sit in, and for that it's a 1 1/8 inch Forstner bit that I found online at Amazon. For the through hole, it calls for a 1/2 inch diameter hole. In this case, I ended up just using a 14mm bit that I found in my local hardware store, and I'm using that instead of a 1/2 inch because it's just a clearance hole. It doesn't need to fit tight. Now that bit's too short, so I did also purchase a longer 14mm bit, and I just finished that hole on my bench. To create the mortise for the bench vise, on one of the legs you've got to cut out quite a bit of material, And to do that, I'm hogging out initially some of the material using a Forstner bit, and then I'll come back in with a router to clean it up. To create this mortise and the rest of the mortises, I did go ahead and purchase a new guide for my router. Now, Makita said this wouldn't fit on my router, but as you can see, it works pretty good. I found this on Amazon for 50 bucks, and I can say this was a really, really good purchase. It allows you to fine tune exactly the placement of the bit, and it's much wider than what comes with the router. I found this to really be nice and stable, and I did not really have to go back and clean up the long edges along the long grain. I did clean up the ends where the bit left sort of the rounded edge, but I just did that quickly with a chisel. The pin for the leg vise, there's two of them. There's one pin on the leg and there's another pin on the chop itself. That pin, that hole needs to go all the way through both of the pieces, and that's a pretty deep hole. This first one is, I think, 5¼ inches deep. The chop is 9 inches deep. So I did that with a combination of a 3/8 inch drill bit that I already had, plus a long 3/8 inch bit that I had to buy online. And I did actually find that, and I'll leave a link down below where I found that 3/8 inch bit. To make the chop for my split-top Roubo bench, I'm going to be using this piece of walnut. I've actually got two of them that I'm going to glue together to get to the thickness that is needed. Now, this is a little over 9 inches wide, and it's way too wide for my jointer. I would normally flatten one face, flip it over, put it through the thickness planer. And I don't want to split it in half and then have to glue it back together. So what I'm going to do is I built myself a sled that I can use in my thickness planer. And it's really simple. It's just a piece of really thick, I think this is probably 18 millimeter, 3/4 inch chipboard with a laminate on top, and then it was just left over from another project. And then I've got a couple of pieces of wood here to keep everything straight. I've also got a wedge that I'll use under one of the corners to keep it flat as it goes through. And that'll get one side completely flat, and then I can flip it over and put it through the thickness planer as normal. It'll take a while because I'm going to have to take a lot of very light passes to get over this, but I think in the end it'll look a lot better and be much stronger than trying to glue 4 pieces together to make the chop. All 4 corners are sitting stable on the sled, so I don't even think I'm going to need a wedge to hold this. I think the 2 rails here should hold everything in place as I send it through. Now I need to drill the second 3/8 inch hole, which goes through the entire 9-inch width of the chop. To do that, I came up with this kind of crazy construction. I started off by milling up some lumber to a thickness that is consistent, and I mounted that onto my bench. I took my drill press off of the stand where I normally have it and mounted it onto that riser. And then I flipped the whole thing around so that I just sort of loosened up the Allen key that's on the stem there for the drill press, rotated the whole thing around, and that allowed me to get to this 9-inch wide board. I also spent a lot of time shimming and checking that bit was actually perfectly 90 degrees front, back, and sideways. I transferred the lines from one side around to the other side and marked where the hole should be. So now I've got 2 locations, one on the one side and one on the other side. I drilled from one side, I flipped the whole thing over and drilled from the other side instead of using the long bit in this case, and then I just used the hand drill to sort of finish it off. And I found that was actually pretty accurate. I actually found I didn't need the longer bit in the end. For the front leg vise, I also purchased the Benchcrafted Glide, and that has this acetal bushing. So you need to be able to create two concentric holes. One is a hole just deep enough so that the acetal bushing sits just below the surface of the front left leg, and then right in the middle of that, a through hole to accept the vise hardware parts. So this little trick I saw on Gary Nellis's channel, and I'll leave a link down below for that. It's really slick. I've attached this plywood board on top of my left leg there, and I've just got some double stick tape to hold that on. So I've got my plywood template mounted with double stick tape. I've positioned everything, raised everything just to the right level that I can take off the hole saw after I've drilled it through the plywood and a little bit into the leg. Then I'll put on the Forstner bit that I need, and that'll start my through hole, the 32 millimeter through hole, or inch and a quarter. And then I can finish that hole after I get everything taken apart. I'll pry out the plug before I continue drilling here. And now I'll put in my inch and a quarter Forstner bit, which I will use for this hole as well as a hole on the other leg, on the right hand front leg, which is used as a hole for your finger to pop out the bench dog on the far end. My really horrible small hobby drill press here is really a common theme you'll see throughout this. Building the base requires a lot of really accurate holes. If that's one thing I could do in the future is replace this and get a proper full-size, really nice quality drill press, I would definitely do it. It's worth it. This took me a lot of time to mess around with. And now I'm just using a templating bit with a bearing on it that rides on the inside of that hole that I've started. At this point I probably don't need the plywood template anymore because I'm deep enough. There I'm just using a set of calipers to check the depth. Once I get it down deep enough for the acetal bushing, then I'm done. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the hardware that goes on the chop. And first I've got to drill and then tap a couple of holes. So tapping holes in wood is not something that I've ever done. I've certainly done that in metal, but not in wood. So what I did is I purchased a couple of these, the same exact one. They're pretty inexpensive, and I chopped the head off of one of them so that I can go all the way down to the bottom of that hole. I started off by drilling a couple of 1/4-inch pilot holes, and then I switched to the first full-length tap. This was much easier than I thought it was going to be. You just have to go really slow and do not push the drill. Let the tap pull itself into the hole and let the drill wind itself back out of the hole as well. I practiced a bit on some walnut that I had sitting around. Found it to be pretty simple. And now I switch to the tap that I cut the head off of to make it flat so that it'll go all the way to the bottom of that hole. And that was pretty simple as well. Again, I didn't push, I just let the tap sort of find its way into the threads that I've already made there until it bottomed out. And now I'm going to focus my attention on the rails. These are the short rails, and there's also 2 long rails. And I'm using a marking gauge to first make sure that everything is exactly the same distance in, and I'm also doing that, and you can see I'm going over it several times because I want a nice deep line there so that I can use my chisel later to clean up those shoulders. I did this on the table saw with a dado stack, and yes, I live in Switzerland, which is in Europe, and we are allowed to use dado stacks here, despite what some people might think. It is not illegal. My table saw just accepts them. There's just some table saws that don't accept them here in Europe. What I do is I sneak up on it. So I start with a fairly wide tenon or fat tenon, and I just do the end, and I just keep checking to make sure that that's fitting correctly. Once I've got the fit correctly, then I can start cutting all the way across the tenon there. I've got my fence moved over to the spot where the dado stack will just come in contact with that line with about a millimeter, or maybe a 16th or a 32nd of an inch. That'll give me enough room for my chisel to land. If you go much less than that, it's almost too small to get your chisel in there. You really need to have a little bit of material to work with. So I sort of sneak up on that fit as well. I put my chisel about halfway between the edge and the marking gauge line because it's just still a little bit too much material, so I sort of have it, and then on the next pass I'll sink my chisel into that marking gauge knife, and that'll give me a nice clean shoulder without pushing the material backwards towards away from the shoulder. One thing I'll do quite often when I'm trying to fit tenons into mortises is I'll just take my pencil and sort of mark the edges down maybe a quarter to a half an inch down. When I put the tenon in here, as it goes through, it's going to, wherever it touches and it drags, it's going to pick up some of that pencil. If I just plane that off, it takes me just a few times to fit this in fully into the mortise, leaving a nice tight fit. So right away I can see that I'm touching on this side. Now here I'm just using that same 3/8 inch bit that I used before to drill the dowel holes for the dowels that will go into the short rails. And I'm making a mark on the rails very lightly with the hammer there so they don't go too deep. And then I'll go back later and I will offset those holes by a 32nd or a 16th, something like that. I found it slightly easier here to use my marking gauge, so I set my marking gauge to the depth where that mark is that I just left with the 3/8 inch drill bit. And then I measure that and I move the marking gauge out about a 16th or a 32nd, and then I put a new line just behind that hole that's left by the drill there, and I'll use that to drill the 3/8 inch hole in the rails. Now I attach the long rails to the legs, And you remember I put a 14 millimeter hole, a clearance hole for the knockdown bolts, and you can see it there just below the clamp. Now I'm using the long 14 millimeter drill bit that I have, and I am extending that hole from the leg through the long rail, and I just put a little bit of wax on there because it's making a horrible squealing noise, and that'll help to reduce that and help this bit go all the way through. It's a pretty long hole. You've got to get pretty deep into that rail. Now you've got to determine where the barrel nut will line up with that bolt. And Benchcrafted does a nice job of explaining how to do this. I used a piece of white paper there behind the bit, and then I just used a ruler there, a metal edge, to align the edge of the bit, and then I marked it down the length of the rail so that I can find where that bit is sitting inside the rail. I didn't film it, but after marking for that hole for the barrel nut right there, I used a 25 millimeter or just slightly shy of 1 inch diameter Forstner bit to drill a little bit past where the long bit is sitting. I used my dado stack again to make the cut there along the length of all of the rails, and that holds the ledger strip. And the ledgers were pretty simple to make, just a little bit of playing around with the fit to make sure that they're nice. And you can see that they don't go right to the shoulders, so they're about maybe an 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch shy of the shoulders, so that it doesn't impede the joint coming together. And now it's time to glue the short rails to the legs so that you end up with 2 sub-assemblies. I went ahead and applied a little bit of glue. Not everybody does here. Those drawbore pegs, I made mine out of walnut, are pretty strong. When those go in, they go in with quite a bit of force. It really draws that rail quite tightly into the leg. Honestly, you probably don't need glue at all here, but I decided to go ahead and do it. I think it'll make for a really strong joint. I don't think I'm ever going to have to take this leg apart, especially since I've got the Knockdown Hardware. Those 2 sub-assemblies are pretty small and already quite manageable. The front right leg has 3 holes in it, and those are for a hold fast. I will use a 19 millimeter hold fast, so I drilled a 19 millimeter hole. To do that, I used a plunge on my router to plunge a 19 millimeter spiral up down flush cutter. I took away the bearing to initially plunge that cut, and then I used a bit that I found on Amazon. I just took off the threads on the front of that thing. They were just burying themselves in the wood and getting stuck. So once I did that, I could finish those 19 millimeter holes all the way through. And that pretty much wraps up the base. So for a total of 39 holes, I spent about $200, costing about $5.50 per hole. And some of those bits I will reuse on the top, especially for the dog holes and the holdfast holes.